Hello and welcome back to the Shardeum Build in Public live stream. If you're joining us for the first time, we are using this live stream as an opportunity to build in public and to carry our community along as we try to show you the things we work on internally at Shardeum and also help inspire you to contribute and become a committer so that we can all collectively build the Shardeum that we love and want to have. Last week we built out this. Let me actually show that. So last week we set up this node server that monitors our services. At the moment, we're monitoring the JSON RPC server, the Explorer, and just a couple of all these other services that we want to continuously check. And if they are down for any reason, we want to set up a status page like this to show every user on Shardeum the state of our network, basically. So we've just done the first step of it, which is basically pulling all of these services and using Prometheus to store that data so that we can continue to report our uptime. So what we want to do on this stream is set up more granular checks to be sure that when we say that the service is up, that it is in fact up. At the moment, if you look at our implementation here, what we're doing is we're making an API call to the services, and once we get a successful response, we update Prometheus and say, hey, this service is online. But sometimes you can get a successful status response and still get an empty page, right? So we want to account for when that happens and set up some expected response variables so that when we get a response back from the server, we want to compare that response we get from the server from a hard-coded response that we expect that server to give us, right? This will all make sense when we start working it out. So instead of just relying on Prometheus to figure out if a successful response is in fact successful, we want to also add some kind of second level of security to be sure that we are getting an expected response from the server. All right, let's go ahead and do that. So if you look at our services.json file, you'd see that we have this is where we have all the services that we want to monitor. So for each of these service, we want to basically expect something, right? So what I want to do is basically click each of these servers, and based on the kind of response we get, we would then know how to mock that response. So right now we're getting a node list, an array of node lists, and it has like 10 items, and we have a sign object with an owner and a sig. So what I want to do here is how do we mock this to be sure that when we get this response back from the server, we can see that the server is online. So let's try to do that here. So let's add an expected response field. Let's do expected response, right? And since this is giving us back, we can do an object here, and we see that we get an array of node list items. So let's define that. Yeah, let's do node list. I think it's a capital L for the list, node list, right? This is going to be an array. And the way that I want to try to mock this is to say, let the array at least have 2 items, right? Let it have at least 2 items. I know there's 10 at the moment. Like if I collapse the node list array, you see we've got 10 items in there. But right now, let's check for 2 items. So if the node list array contains at least 2 nodes, then we can say that the server is online. I think we can also do something with the sign object here. This value is going to continue to be the same. The signature might change, but the owner will remain the same. So let's mock that as well. Let's do, we have a sign object, and in there we are going to have the owner, right? And the value, we're just going to grab that from here, right? So this value will continue to be the same. That's why it's a good one to use to mock this. So what we're saying basically is every time Prometheus pings our server, our archiver server, if he gets a response in this format, then we can say that the server is in fact online, right? So it's just, I'm going to duplicate that because we will expect the same response for both Archiver servers since we're doing the same thing. So let's do that here. And I'm just gonna give it a comma here. Okay, that's for the Archiver server. For the monitor server, let's click on that. See what we get. So we're going to get a HTML page basically, yes, and it's giving us all of these values. What I want to get here, just to make it easy, is I'm going to look for a text, ascending or descending. Maybe that's what I will use. I just want to get a string out of the HTML that we get from this page, right? So let's do, where is monitor server one? Here. So let's do expected response. And I'm going to just use ascending because if you look at here, you see that we've got these two buttons, ascending and descending. I don't even think they are buttons. I think they are just text. So let's do that. Ascending. I need to spell it correctly though. And yeah, so I think that should be it. So if we get a response back from the monitor one server and that response contains this text, then we can say that we've got now our expected response. Let's do the same for the JSON RPC server. Let's have an expected response. Okay, so I'm just accepting Copilot here, but this is not what I would typically, I wouldn't use that value basically because it will continue to change. So I will use these two values because they will continue to remain the same. Every time we make an API call to this endpoint and we pass in this body, we are going to get this expected response back. And you can try this out with Postman if you want to try that out, but I've already done this before, so I think I will just continue. You can make a post request to this endpoint and provide these properties as the request body, and you should get this expected response back. So I'll leave that like that for now and just move on to the next one, which is the Explorer server. So we can mock an expected response for the Explorer. Let's do, and this is going to also, this is a website, so we basically going to get like all of this data coming back from the Explorer server. So I'm just going to grab the first one I see here. So let's do the Shardeum BetaNet Explorer. So this is going to be my expected response. So if I get that from the content that I get back from our server, then I can say that the Explorer page is online. All right, I think we just do the same thing for the website and for the documentation. So let's do expected response, Shardeum website. I don't think we have the Shardeum website on the current Shardeum website. What we have though is this text that says Shardeum EVM based sharded layer 1 blockchain. So that is the hero text on the Shardeum website. So we want to check, when we check the shardeum.org website, we want to look through the HTML response we get back, and we want to be sure that this text exists in that response. If it does, then we know that our website is online. And the same applies to the documentation, right? So we have expected response will be Shardeum. So if you look at the Shardeum documentation, you will find this text as well. So let me just grab that and put it here. Shardeum is a dynamic state sharded EVM based layer 1 with low transaction fees forever. So this is again the hero text that you will see when you go to the Shardeum documentation. All right, a quick recap. We are setting up an expected response property on our different services. And for each one, we are going to compare the response we get back from the server from our hard-coded expected response. And if it matches, then we can then, confidently say that the server or that particular service is online. So let's save that. And then what we want to do next is come back to our monitor.ts file, and we can add our expected response here. So we have expected response. Yeah, we can do any for now. Cool. Now this is where we can start doing that checks that we want to do. We want to check, continue to check for the status of the response that we get from the server, right? Because we don't just want to, check if the responses match. We want to do that, but we also want to check that we are not getting like a 404, a 501 or something like that. So let's do, let's have a const status is okay, will be response dot status should be above or equal to 200, right? And then it should be less than 300, right? If the response status is not within this range, then the server is not online, or that particular service is not online. Then I want to have an is expected response included, is expected response included. I want to add that, and initially let's set it to false. So this is the property I'm just going to use to check if the response that I expect, which is the one that we've set up here, is found in the response body that we get back from that service. So we'll use that to track that. And then the next thing I want to do, right, if you look at our services, you see that sometimes our expected response is like a JSON object. Sometimes it's just like HTML and we grab a string from it. So we have to handle those separately. So let's handle the string first. So we can do if the type of our service dot expected response is a string. Let's do string first. So here we can handle the string. So we can do let the response body be response.data. This is because we're using Axios, so it's going to give us a response.data object back. And then I want to do the response string. We are going to get that from body.toString, right? And let's do lowercase, and let's trim that as well. Okay, so that should do it. And then let's also do the same thing for our expected response string. So let's do expected response string is service.expected response. Yes, I think I'll accept that, but I will add toString here. So we make it a string, lowercase, and then we trim. Good. So what I want to do now is update the value of is expected response included, right? So we can do is expected response included will be response.string if it includes the expected response. Fantastic. Then we can do an else. So this basically will mean like the type of the expected response is not a string, in which case it will be like an object. And if that is the case, then we want to handle it separately, right? Let's do body again is response.data, and then is expected response included is going to be equal to, we are going to create this function. Let's call it check JSON response, right? And we will pass it the body and the expected response. So we haven't created this function yet, but we're going to do that right away. So basically what we're doing is if the expected response type is a string, we handle the string here and update our variable. Otherwise, we are going to have a check JSON response body that we'll want to use to do that. So let me actually just go ahead and do that right here. Let's do check JSON response body. It accepts the body and the expected response. So this would be the response from the server. and this will be the expected response that we've marked. Cool. So the first thing we want to do is we want to iterate over each key in the expected response, right? To see if it matches with the actual response that we get from the server. So let's do for const key of object dot keys expected response. I want to change this to expected response for consistency's sake. And now what we want to do is check that for each key in the response, we want to check that the same key exists in the expected response, right? So let's do if response, yes, this is correct. So if the keys we have in the expected response do not exist in the actual response that we get from the server, then we just return false. Now, if the key exists in both objects, we want to check the type of the value that is associated with that key. For instance, if the value is an object, but it's not an array, we will recursively call the check.json response function to compare the nested objects inside of response and expected response. So let's do that. So let's do type of expected response key is an object and it's not an array. Expected response key. Then we want to recursively call the check.json response function with the corresponding nested objects from both the actual response and the expected response. So let's do that. We'll do this dot check.json response, and we pass in the response key and the expected response key, and we return false. Perfect. But if the value is an array, so let's check. So let's do else if array is array, which is the expected key. So what we want to do now is we want to do if it's not an array, then this is the response key. We also want to check that in the case where it is an array, that it has a value that is greater than 0. So let's do response.length in this case is not equal to 0, because if it is equal to 0, then it means there's nothing in it and it's supposed to return false. So we simply return false. And then the last thing we want to check is if the value is neither an object or an array, we simply just compare the values with each other directly, right? If they are not equal, we return false. So let's do that as our closing statement. Else if response key is not equal to the expected response key, we simply return false. Otherwise, we return true. So once we compare all of that and everything checks out, we return true. So coming back to our function, here what we're doing is, if the type of the service expected response is a string, we handle the string by looking at the expected response string and the actual response string we get from the server, and we check if the response string we get from the server has the string from the expected response that we have defined. And I'm seeing that there's actually an error in my spelling here. Let's do response string. Cool. And when the expected response is not a string, then we want to use this .check.json response to handle whatever data type it is. It could be an array, it could be an object. and that's what we're doing here. So we're looping over the keys, we're doing all of these checks, and we're returning true in situations where neither of this is the case. So let's save that. And then the last thing that we want to do is we want to make this function to run itself. So basically at this point, Prometheus is going to ping our server every 10 seconds based on our configuration here in our Prometheus config file. You see we have a script interval of 10 seconds. But we also, the last week when we set up this node server, we set up this start periodic check function to run by itself, so that we don't depend on Prometheus pings. So what I'm going to do is just call that function in the constructor. Let's do this start periodic check and save. And our server is restarting. I'm just gonna stop it for now until I'm done. So now that we have the functionality to check if the service is okay and to see if the expected response is included in our server response, we want to do those checks now before we update Prometheus, right? So I'm gonna cut this out and do if our status check is okay and our expected response is included, then I want to update Prometheus and say, okay, this server does in fact have the value of 1 and it is online. Otherwise, we don't have an else. We're going to do the same thing, right? Except this time we're setting the value to false and saying, oh, this server is not online. So in any case, it should be offline. But before we do that, the first thing I want to do is set the value of this check service status to false, because at this point we're not currently checking the status, and want to do that for the else as well. And we can save that. So now, if the status of the response is okay and the expected response is included in the server response, then we can say that this value is online, and we update Prometheus and we write some logs to keep ourselves informed. And lastly, I think the only thing that I want to do is let me increase the timeout value from 5 seconds to 10 seconds, right? Sometimes, this pause can take a little longer than is expected. So I'll say if the service timeout should be 10 seconds. So any service check that takes longer than 10 seconds should time out. This also means I can improve my interval here from 5 to 15 seconds. So let's give it a 5 seconds buffer before we start a new service check. Okay, so let's do this. I'm going to npm run start again. And let me zoom in here so that our logs are more visible. All right, fingers crossed. So with any log, our services should all be online. Looking at the services, we have everything online as it should be. Okay, we're getting some logs now. So we see that documentation is online. Basically, all our services are online as expected. So let's verify that that is the case. I'm going to jumble up the URL for the monitor, and I'm going to jumble up the URL for the archiver server too. So now, after this restarts, we should see that the monitor will be offline and the archiver too should be offline. So let's see if that works. I'm going to open up this a bit more. Okay, now we have monitor 1 is offline and archiver 2 is offline. So it looks like our granularity service check is working as expected, and this is what we wanted to achieve on today's live stream. If you want to join us next week, we're going to be looking at how to set up a front-end application that will consume this data to give us the functionality that we wanted, right? Remember, what we were going for is something like this. So we're going to do that next week. Feel free to join us and let us know if you have any questions or if you want to contribute to any of these projects, and we'll be happy to help you out. Bye and have a good one.